Honey, I'm home.
I'm in here.
I am famished. The whole way home I was thinking about the leftover chili I put aside last night.
I ate that.
What? Didn't you remember that I said I wanted to have it after work? Were you worried that I would be disappointed?
Yes. And no.
What's going on? You seem kind of weird today.
I want to break up.
What? Why?
I married someone else in Florida last week.
You what? I hate you right now.
Oh, before I forget, you were going to introduce me to your brother, the one who was on Mad Men. I really need to get that guy in my network.
Greg, were you just using me to get to my brother?
See, now you're getting hung up on the idea of being used. It's good to be used. It means you're useful. You want to go get lobster rolls?
You just dumped me, all right?
That was so long ago. Do yourself a favor. Don't turn into one of those people who dwells in the past.
You are a sociopath.
You say that like it's a bad thing.
It's just that I'm so upset. I trusted you. You seemed so charming, and I really let down some of my defenses that what did you do? What is this?
When your voice gets like that, it really bothers my ears. Also, I just bought this pepper spray, and I really want to use it. What am I supposed to do? Wait 10 years to be attacked?
Just get out. I never want to see you again. I got to do something to cheer myself up. Actually, a lobster roll does sound pretty good. Let me just wash my eyes out and drive over to the crab shack and... Where are my car keys? Greg!
I'm just borrowing it.
Today on the show, sociopaths. Love them, hate them, they're here either way. And now he's so vain he probably thinks the show is about him. Colin McEnroe.
It's unusually good acting in that intro. I wish there were sort of Oscars for that kind of thing. They were both wonderful. All right, so we are talking about sociopaths today. In just a second, you're going to meet M.E. Thomas. She is, in fact, a self-describing sociopath, a diagnosed sociopath or psychopath. We'll talk a little bit, too, about the interchangeability or lack thereof of those terms. She's living a nonviolent professional life. She writes under a pseudonym. She could be dealing with you in some other capacity, and you wouldn't even know. You wouldn't know she was M.E. Thomas anyway. Anyway, you're going to meet her in just a second. Here in studio with me is Ariel Baskin-Somers. She's an assistant professor of psychology at Yale. She's interested in the ways in which psychopaths can be trained to process emotion better. Do they have to be psychopaths or sociopaths forever? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about a lot of things today, about this term, too, that it really does get slung around, right? You use it. You apply it to anybody that you're basically mad at, anybody who strikes you as having been a jerk. If they cut you off in traffic, if they're your ex-boyfriend, girlfriend, ex-spouse, yeah, she's a sociopath. But, I mean, the word has to mean something more than that. It's got to be, in order to be a useful word, it's got to actually have some meaning. So let's talk about that. If you have questions, if you have agonizing experiences that you would like to share with us, if you are a sociopath, tweet us at WNPR-Colin, where the sociopath that you heard in the intro will perhaps tweet back at you, WNPR-Colin. So, Ariel Baskin-Somers, I'm going to start with you. Well, first of all, we do kind of use the terms sociopath and psychopath interchangeably, at least in common speech. Clinically, do those words have distinct meanings?
They actually do, and thank you so much for having me. Usually the word sociopath and psychopath is distinguished in terms of the root cause or etiology. So psychopathy tends to be more associated with a innate or almost born with brain mechanism or deficit, whereas a sociopath is more developed through the environment and most importantly through poor or harsh parenting style. So David Lykken early in the 50s really laid out how these two pathways towards disinhibition, criminal behavior can develop, but they are quite distinct and tend to have differences in terms of behavior and cause.
Do they have commonalities as well?
Absolutely. So both can seem quite charming, both can seem manipulative, both engage in impulsive and chronic antisocial behavior, but why they do tends to be very different. At
least with psychopaths, I get the feeling just even looking at the names of the studies that you've done and the work that you've done, there's some effort anyway to maybe even sort of locate this somewhere in physiology, right? To figure out whether the amygdala or some other part of the brain is involved in the what a psychopath ultimately does and becomes.
Absolutely. So if we believe that part of the reason why psychopaths engage in this chronic antisocial behavior, lying and manipulativeness or glibness, we might be able to identify specific neural pathways that mediate that behavior and contribute to their essential skill deficit in terms of being able to engage in adaptive behavior. That's really important because if we're able to identify pathways in psychopathy that contribute to their behavior, then we're also able to hopefully train or treat those pathways through different types of remediation programs.
This is obviously interesting just at a sheer clinical level, but it has all kinds of ramifications that spread out through society. This is a term, particularly psychopath, is a term that's taken pretty seriously by the criminal justice system. There are people who wind up staying in prison longer because they score higher on this now pretty standardized scale for psychopathy, right?
Correct. So often the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or PCLR, developed by Robert Hare, is used to assess psychopathy. Now, this involves doing a life history interview, collecting collateral information, and rating an individual on a 20-question scale. And someone can earn up to 40 points on the PCLR. If someone is 30 or above, they're typically described as psychopath.
So, and once again, this it's a conversation you and I can have at a clinical or scholarly level, but there are criminal justice systems that will direct outcomes for somebody based on where they score.
Correct. Often higher scores in psychopathy are associated with more versatility of crime, more violence, and higher rates of recidivism. And so based on those statistics, often criminal justice systems do use that as a risk predictor or risk factor, for better or worse. There is some research to suggest that that is not the only or most predictive risk factor for recidivism, but it's one of the better ones that we have now.
All right, let's add to the conversation M.E. Thomas. That is a pseudonym for the author of Confessions of a Sociopath, A Life Spent Hiding in Plain Sight. And we should also mention that she is the creator and host of a popular blog called sociopathworld.com. I think it's been around for since about 2008 and has many, many, many thousands of visitors. So some of them actual sociopaths and other people who are commenting on sociopaths that they've known, and lots of other people with other reasons for visiting. But M.E. Thomas, first of all, welcome to our conversation.
Thanks so much.
And just maybe for starters, tell us your story as you know it. You self-identify as a sociopath. You're listening to Ariel Baskin-Somers talk about all that in pretty hard-edged clinical terms. Translate that into the way that you understand your own life and your own character.
Yeah, well, I have been diagnosed as a sociopath. I always knew that I was different growing up. Sometimes I attribute it to maybe I was just smarter, maybe I was a little bit more clever than my childhood friends. Maybe they weren't seeing the opportunities for exploitation because of that, for instance. And I didn't really come to grips with how different I was until in college, when I had several kind of relationships fail, and I ended up getting blacklisted from the program that I was in because I stole a friend's personal journal on, this school trip, and there was a lot of drama, and I sort of realized that I do this all the time. So I started doing a little bit of introspection about myself, and I realized I'm manipulative, I'm cold-hearted, I'm, every person seems kind of like an instrumental object for me to control, like a chess piece, kind of naturally. I don't feel empathy, really. Ever since I was little, I remember one time watching TV, and there's this little boy crying on the TV, and I made fun of him, and my dad was like, "Have you no empathy?" And I really didn't. I didn't then, and then I still struggle with it now. And I was speaking to one of a classmate of mine, someone who was in the same program, and I described to them the characteristics that I had sort of learned to identify with myself. And she said, "You might want to consider the possibility you're a sociopath." And I read the characteristics online, and I thought, yeah, this actually really does fit. This explains a lot. But, I was doing pretty well again by that point, and so I continued on just doing what I was doing until my life failed again. Every 3 years or so, relationships fail, losing a very prestigious job. And then I thought, this can't keep happening every 3 years. This was when I was in my 20s. If this keeps happening, it's going to happen 20 more times in my lifetime. am I going to be able to survive every time and move on to some other place where people don't know my name or change career paths or whatever else I had been doing in order to get past it then? So I decided I need to look more into this and try to figure out if I really am a sociopath, and if so, how to deal with it, how to make it work for me in my life.
And we should say that you did take the exact test that that Ariel was talking about before, and that you did score in the psychopath range of that particular test. Although I wanted to ask you something about that. When you took that test, I read the section of your book about when you took that test. You had already kind of self-identified as a sociopath, and you'd really begun to kind of add that notion to your identity, and maybe even begin thinking about being, kind of a high-profile sociopath as opposed to a completely secretive one. So did you have any incentive maybe to skew your answers a little bit so that you get a 19 or a 20 out of 24 instead of a 15?
I don't think that you could say that it was unbiased. I knew too much about it. I took the screening version. I didn't take the full version that they give, for instance, prisoners when they have, a full criminal record. Maybe I had an incentive. I don't know really how you would say that I have an incentive to do it, though. It's identifying this way has sort of ruined my life, in some ways. Once people find out that I'm a sociopath, then it's like, suddenly I'm inhuman and I can be treated however they want, and there are no sort of repercussions, or they don't empathize with me anymore. They just do whatever they think they need to protect themselves, which is often very negatively directed towards me.
All right, I'm going to ask you one more question, then I'll get some questions back to Ariel. But based on what she said at the beginning of the show, and then based on my reading of your book, if we're going to concede that dichotomy between sociopath and psychopath, I really would call you a sociopath, just because reading your book, it seems to me, you really did have kind of a rough upbringing in some ways. Your father beat you, right? I mean, he hit you. You tell a very disturbing story about your parents leaving you and your brother in your park and just driving away, even as the two of you ran after the car and screamed. You were, I think, 10 and 11. I mean, I feel like I'm reading the story of somebody whose environment shaped them into a sociopath, as opposed to somebody who was born with the neural wiring to be a psychopath. How do you react to that statement?
I guess I can only kind of say my own experience. I'm obviously not an expert, and although I'm aware of the distinctions that some people make about the terms sociopath and psychopath, I'm not sure that they comport entirely with my own experience. I sort of feel like, maybe my upbringing triggered something, but, I provide the example of my brother, who is, an extreme empath, and he's only a year and a half older than me, and he had the exact same upbringing, basically. We basically were together all the time growing up, and so what about that didn't get triggered in him? So to say that, that it's primarily genetic in a psychopath, okay, but there has to be something, too, to be triggered there. There has to be in a sociopath as well. So I guess I kind of think in general more like you have to have the genetic predisposition no matter what. And then you also have to have an environmental trigger, kind of no matter how you make the distinctions between sociopath and psychopath.
I'm going to switch back to Ariel Baskin-Somers for a second, and just I want to talk a little bit more about that physiology. Okay, so let's park for a moment the question of whether M.E. Thomas is a sociopath or a psychopath. Let's talk about people who track pretty well on or poorly, depending on how you think about it, on this scale of psychopathy. So you're scoring very high on that test. Maybe you're already in prison. That's how you got to be a subject in one of these studies. They do a cranial MRI or something on you to be able to look at your brain. What kinds of patterns are you likely to see with 20 of those people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for a long time, the belief was, particularly neurally, that psychopathic individuals had a deficit in processing fear. So that was referred to as the low fear hypothesis. And in the brain, that's often associated with reductions in amygdala activation, which is a very important part of our brain for processing emotions and salient pieces of information. However, recent research that I've completed as well as others at the University of Wisconsin-Madison suggests that it's not a fundamental or pan-situational deficit in emotions that psychopathic individuals have, but rather they tend to have a problem attending to contextual cues. And so what I mean by that is they're basically the worst multitaskers in the world. Once they get focused on their particular goal or focused on a particular feature of information, they're unable to switch their attention to different aspects of their goal. So, for example, if a psychopathic individual walks into a bank to try and steal money, they're going to be so focused on their goal of getting the money and not be able to attend to the little girl crying in the corner or the woman screaming behind the counter. And that tends to be inhibitory or disrupt behavior for most other people, but not the psychopath. And that's why they seem sort of cool, calm, and collected. In terms of the brain, what we tend to see then is that it's really an interaction between that amygdala, that part of your brain that's important for emotions, and also the prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that is important for inhibiting behavior. We tend to see that the prefrontal cortex actually dampens the amygdala response. So again, it's more of an attentional to context problem that is then inhibiting the emotion component. And we see this through a variety of measures, whether it's through brain imaging, through psychophysiology such as startle response and event-related potentials.
All right, so let's try to take that and just for a moment translate it into the language of behavior and moral action and stuff like that. So there's a couple reasons why I should actually pick a better example than this. But okay, so there's a couple of reasons why I don't park in a handicapped spot, besides the fact I'm not handicapped, obviously. Now, one of them would be I would really feel bad, right? If somebody came in a wheelchair and they needed that spot and I was taking it, and, I would feel bad that I deprived them of that. And then the other reason is I could encounter a lot of negative consequences, ranging from simply the obvious disapproval of people yelling at me, whatever, or to somebody giving me a really bad ticket or something like that. It sounds like, in terms of what you just described about the amygdala and the physiology of the psychopath, I'm hearing more of the latter, right? That I can just shut out those kinds of questions. I'm disinhibited and I'm not fearful because I just don't process that kind of stuff. Somebody's going to yell at me. Somebody's going to give me a ticket. Is that the mechanism that you're describing? And does it also include that moral part? Like, I would just personally feel bad too.
Absolutely. I think it's a combination of both things that you're describing. Again, if we think about goal-directed behavior, why would you be parking in the handicap spot? It's usually to get somewhere quickly. Mm-hmm. And so a psychopath might focus on that particular aspect of the goal. And over time, through socialization, most of us consider that moral aspect. But if you have these attentional or emotional deficits that is common in psychopathy, you don't tend to build that elaborative network where you're incorporating the social, moral component as well as the emotional consideration of others.
Emmy Thomas, switching back to you for a second, you're listening to this conversation. All right, well, let's pick the handicap spot. You're in a real hurry. You pull into Big Y parking lot or whatever they call it, supermarkets, wherever it is that you're calling from. You're in a big hurry. You don't see too many closed spaces. There's a handicap spot. Would you pull in there?
It's funny. I don't think I've ever parked in a handicapped spot. And I think it's because, exactly as you say, the advantage of parking in the handicapped spot is, maybe like 30 seconds walk. Maybe if there was no other parking place and I was like, as Ariel says, very goal-driven in that moment to do a particular thing, of course, I wouldn't let something like that stand in my way. But I don't think most people do either. For me, I think that I'm constantly weighing the costs and benefits of my decisions. It's true that I am not an emotional decision maker and I'm not a moral decision maker, but it's not as if, I'm constantly driven by every kind of impulse or whim or in this moment I want to do this. There are, of course, moments when I feel that way, when I feel very much focused and in the moment. And it is true. I do feel like Ariel described what I experience, that I'm so focused on this particular thing that any other cues, somebody's very upset with you or somebody's crying, they don't register. I keep going on and doing what I want until maybe I snap out of it. Most of the time I eventually will snap out of it. especially recently, I've kind of learned to try to be a little bit more aware even in those moments.
All right, let's pick a story from your book. This is a really simple story. It doesn't involve any huge damage to anybody else. Maybe we can think of one of those stories a little bit later. But let's take a really easy one, all right? So you want to go to the beach. You got a friend with you. You need an extra bike. You're in your apartment building where you live. There's a bike there. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to your neighbor, but you want to use it. The neighbor's not there to ask. You just decide you're going to take it. Now, what I notice you do in the book is what you describe is, in fact, building a narrative in your head for why this is okay. And now, rather than just sort of like, screw it, I'm just taking the bike, I'll think about it later, that's not quite what you describe in your book. You describe thinking, well, in some ways it'd actually be good for the bike if I took it. It's got dust all over it. I'll put a little air on the tires. It needs some air in the tires. It's good for the chain to move around, helps lubricate the chain a little bit. I'm actually doing this person a favor by taking this bike that I haven't asked if I can take. Postscript, it didn't work out that well at all. The neighbor found out what happened and didn't see it that way. So to me, that sounds, once again, a little bit different from what Ariel Baskin-Somers is talking about, that you figured out a way to make this okay to do.
Yeah, and that is because the bike story was after I sort of adopted this, I call it a prosthetic moral compass of cost-benefit analysis, like I'm an economist, because most of the time something that is the benefit exceeds the cost, we consider that like a moral action. You help a lady across the street, you get the accolades, you help the lady across the street. You kill somebody, that's terrible because you've deprived them of the life, and for what purpose? That, the harm greatly exceeds the benefits. So most morality does track that, I think. And that's kind of what I learned to do starting in my early 20s. And so I wasn't necessarily kind of justifying my actions so much as saying, what is the cost-benefit answer in the bike story? And because of all the things you mentioned, the bike chain, gets moved and the air gets in the tires and whatever else, the world would have benefited from me taking the bike. And so I said, okay, well then according to this standard, this prosthetic moral compass or code that I've adopted, that's the right answer.
Ariel Baskin-Somers, a lot of the people that you deal with, that you're studying, they're hardcore psychopaths. And, I mean, it's not at a purely theoretical level. I sense a lot of them are in prison, right? Or have been in prison.
All of them.
And all of them are in prison. So they've done pretty horrible things. They're armed robbers. They're, maybe it's Bernie Madoff. I don't know. You're talking to somebody anyway. Will they be constructing the kinds of narratives that you're hearing M.E. Thomas, or are they just not really capable of that?
I think one aspect that's really important to distinguish is typically for individuals who score high on the PCL or the psychopathy checklist, there's an automaticity to their behavior. And so it's driven often by these kind of neural processes we've been talking about. And that automatic process tends to inform almost everything they do and contribute to the chronicity of their antisocial behavior, of their impulsive behavior, of their glibness and manipulativeness. And so it's not necessarily something they do and stop and reflect on. It's just something that has been built up for how they process. It's essentially a different pathway than the rest of us. That's not to say it's not possible to teach them eventually to stop and reflect or to rebuild the neural pathways, but that's not how it initially starts. It initially starts almost like learning to run and keeping pace, and at some point your body just knows how to keep pace over time without having to train yourself.
It's like, so you're saying like muscle memory, essentially.
Exactly.
I mean, Michael Jordan doesn't have to think about how to do a layup every time he does a layup. I'm going to bounce the ball once, move it to my right hand. I mean, he just does it. And you're saying by the time this person that you're studying is 25, 26 years old, this person has done all kinds of antisocial things or exploitive things or flat out illegal things and sometimes violent things in a way that doesn't really require a lot of forethought and planning and justification.
Correct. Typically the neural processes that we're seeing happen very early on and often can happen at a pre-conscious or even before conscious awareness level.
You're listening to a show we recorded a couple of months ago. We'll be right back after this.
My baby is a sociopath. Oh, she's so cold and she's so crass. My baby is a sociopath.
We're talking about psychopaths. We're talking about sociopaths. Ariel Baskin-Somers is with us, an assistant professor of psychology at Yale. Later in the show, we'll also talk about some of her research about ways in which psychopaths can or can't be trained to do things a little bit better, to, in fact, process their emotions in a way maybe similar to the way the rest of us do. Also with us, M.E. Thomas. She wrote the book Confessions of a Sociopath, A Life Hiding in Plain Sight, and runs the popular blog sociopathworld.com. She is a self-professed, diagnosed sociopath or psychopath living in a nonviolent professional life. She writes under a pseudonym. All right, so M.E. Thomas, I'm coming back to you right now, and I want to talk a little bit about this blog, sociopathworld.com. So you've got a lot of people visiting there, people leaving stories, people writing letters, people asking questions, people making comments. Do you notice certain trends among the blog may have had sort of a purpose in your mind when you started it, but are people using the blog, visiting the blog for purposes that seem consistent, trends that surprise you?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I did have a kind of something in mind when I started the blog. I thought, I'm going on this journey, and I, for whatever reason, have always been a journaler. Have always written kind of an account of, and when I was little, it was like all megalomaniacal fantasies, about how smart I was or whatever. But I think the journaling has helped me to become more self-aware, and so that's why I wanted the blog to be, kind of leaving breadcrumbs for people that would follow me. I started it in 2008, and at that point I was very aware that everything that was put on the Internet would last for forever. So I thought, this is a great way to kind of put stuff out there and kind of just track my journey as I come to understand what this disorder is and, hopefully grow to accommodate it better in my life. And some people come on for that. I mean, that's kind of been the mission is let's not glorify it or talk about ways to manipulate, but I do talk about ways to manipulate because I want people to be aware of what sociopaths do, too. There's probably an audience, half of the people are just looky-loos, maybe, and then the other quarter are people who have been seriously harmed by a sociopath, and the other quarter are people who identify as a sociopath or are at least exploring that term as possibly being an identifying term for them. And sometimes, the sociopaths and the victims of the sociopaths, they get in these huge fights and arguments, and people try to ruin each other on the blog. So, I mean, that's the sort of stuff that happens in real life, too.
It's actually something that happens on all blogs, not just yours. I mean,
yeah, in the comment section, right, of anything. It's
everybody's
terrible.
inner sociopath comes out there. I have so many questions about that. I just do want to emphasize the fact that the term looky-loos is not recognized by the DSM-5. But some people would say, you know what, I don't think you're a sociopath, M.E. Thomas, because sociopaths don't want people to know that they're sociopaths. I mean, obviously, you're using a pseudonym, but sociopaths don't want to self-identify that way. Usually, if you're dealing with a sociopath, you find out in a fairly unpleasant way somewhere down the line that many things you've been told were not true, and stuff that you used to have is missing, and we can make the standard list. But we don't typically find out because the person says, "Hi, I'm a sociopath." So, I mean, would you at least concede that you're a little unusual that way?
Yeah, I think that I am unusual, although it's interesting you say, I've kind of followed the comment sections, and recently there have been a couple sociopaths who are kind of trying the experiment of coming out. What would it be like if at least my close friends and family members knew that I self-identify this way, or at least that I have these particular characteristics, even if the diagnosis doesn't apply 100% to me. And it's interesting reading their experiences. A lot of people will sort of take that information and kind of like shuffle it away. It reminds me, I was reading an article yesterday about this same-sex couple in a small town in turn of the last century, America, and about how people had a similar, their townsfolk, their other neighbors had a similar way to treat them. Like, okay, we're aware that you're a couple and you consider yourself a couple, and we realize that you provide good things to the town, and we like you as people, and so we're just kind of ignore the inconvenient truth that you are living in sin, something that we would find reprehensible. So I think that's how a lot of people, in my life kind of treat it. It's this inconvenient truth that, for the most part, they don't think about.
Again, so many questions. I'm going to ask you one more question before we go back to Ariel, see if I can set this up. So you may have noticed, Emmy Thomas, in the intro that we did, there was actually a little quote from you. I think it's not from your book, but in your blog, where at one point our putative sociopath in the intro says something like, well, now you're getting all hung up about the idea of being used. It's not a terrible thing to be used. It means that you're useful. I think you wrote something like that on your blog. Now, here's an area where I think most people's values and understanding of that linguistic expression would diverge in the woods from you. Most people think it's bad to be used. Most people want to be treated as a means as an end rather than a means. I should get that right. Most people think, oh, no, that means you're not treating me as a real person. You're treating me as a stepping stone to something else that you want. My actual humanity, individuality are incidental to you. So would you concede in any way that most people would be troubled by that statement? It's not so bad to be used. Don't get hung up about it.
I think that most people would believe, would have a problem with it. It's not so bad to be used. But I think, there is that counter argument. What is your value to the world or to anything if you're not useful at all? I guess it kind of gets to this fundamental question of what makes humanity valuable. Why should we treat anybody as, a person? And I'm curious for the answer, too, because, having come out as a sociopath, a lot of people no longer think that I am valuable according to their criterion. So it can't just be that other people don't have criterions and I do, but that they have different ones that I do. And I generally think if somebody's useful, then I don't care if they're, a criminal, or I don't care if they're, if we take it back to the turn of the last century, gay, or they're living in sin, or they're Catholic, or they're Jewish, or there are any number of these different characteristics of people that we've come to sort of vilify over the years. I don't care about that sort of stuff. I just think they're useful to me. And so the good thing about seeing life that way is, you don't live in this xenophobic world of prejudice in which you will not allow somebody a chance because they don't fit the kind of mold of what you expect useful, valuable humanity to be.
We had tried to book Immanuel Kant for this show, but it turns out he's dead and in Switzerland. So he'd be the perfect person to jump in here. But since he's not here, I'm going to go back over to Ariel Baskin-Somers for a second, not for a Kantian explanation of means versus ends, but when you're interviewing and working with these people who are prisoners, who are high-scoring psychopaths. I feel like in the conversation I just had with Emmy Thomas, there really was a pretty substantial divergence, not just in our value systems, but even kind of how we process the language that we used. I feel as though the statement, you used me, is inevitably a negative reflection on whomever I'm talking to. She clearly doesn't. Is this a process or a pattern that you notice when you're talking to these people, that they often really will process a statement in a very radically different way from the way, say, you would?
Yes, we see that all the time, and that's actually part of what we consider when we rate the PCLR. So we often use the words and the terms and stories that individuals who are incarcerated are telling us to rate items such as glibness, thinking that they're better than other people, these kind of charming stories where they tend to place themselves in a really good light, often at the expense of other people.
Emmy Thomas, one thing I've seen you write is this notion of you don't want to be judged for your syndrome. You're very open about your syndrome. You talk very freely about it, but you don't want to be judged that way, right? You want it to be understood as a disease, that you've got a disease. I think you said if you had schizophrenia, and people wouldn't be saying, well, what a creep, So they'd be saying, well, obviously this is a disease. It's got an organic component. Nobody decides to be schizophrenic. It's not a whole bunch of volitional decisions. You'd like to be understood that way. So let me ask you this question. What part of you is different and separate from everything that makes you a sociopath?
It's such a good question. I have religious beliefs. I'm Mormon, and I think and having grown up that way as a child, I think they inform the way that I sort of view myself, and maybe that's one of the reasons why it's possible for me to try to, as much as I have, separated my behaviors and my kind of default choices, what would happen impulsively if I didn't go through the motions of, a further analysis before I just act on every impulse. my religious beliefs suggest that I was a spirit before I came to this world. And so everybody manifests themselves differently. I have I have a Down syndrome uncle and Down syndrome aunt. And frequently when I interact with them, I think, what would these people be like if they didn't have Down syndrome? And I have a friend who's schizophrenic, and I think, what would he be like if he wasn't schizophrenic? And so it's a similar kind of guess with me. What would I be like if I weren't a sociopath? But, when my Down syndrome uncle does something, terribly, like, has an accident in the pool, does anybody get upset and, yell at him? No, we just he's held to a different standard. He's obviously different from everybody else, so you don't hold him to the same standard, even though that is a very antisocial thing that he did, and it did very much harm everybody else. But it's like, he doesn't know better, or that's just the nature of his particular disorder.
Although I'll stop you there and say, some people would say, well, yeah, the difference is, M.E. Thomas, you do know better. You just don't care.
Yeah, it is true. That's kind of the nature of being a sociopath, is that you ask, and this is why they get sent to prison rather than the insanity defense. Insanity defense is you didn't know better, at least in that moment, right? You were too crazy, irrational to be able to know the difference between right and wrong. Sociopaths are aware, but, it's sort of, as Ariel was saying, it's one thing to be kind of aware of it. You may be aware that your wife is going to be angry, if you have an affair. But sometimes it's another thing to kind of control that behavior. Just because I'm aware of it doesn't mean that I have 100% control over my behavior. And I think that worries people, but who does have 100% control over their behavior?
Betsy Kaplan actually does, our producer. But she's the only person I know. Everybody else is a little bit out of control. Well, actually, that leads me on one last question before we break. I'm going to come back to you, Ariel Baskin-Summers. All right, so some diseases are understood as sort of ones or zeros, and some diseases are understood as continuums. So increasingly when we talk about autism, we really talk about a continuum. There's a syndrome, but it manifests itself with different degrees of severity. Now, for practical purposes, you got to have some kind of cutoff, and it's whatever it is. You got a 25, you're in the study. You got a 24, you're not, just because you've got to do that. But how do you see psychopaths? Do you see that as a continuum, or do you see it as something that really can be established as kind of a bright line?
Yeah, this is a really hot debate in the fields of psychopathy now. I will say that there does seem to be evidence that once individuals cross a certain point, for example, on the PCLR, if they're 30 or above, their behavior is categorically different than those who are below. So, for example, we tend to see people who are 30 or above on the PCLR show deficits in startle potentiation, this sort of blink reflex that we have when we're scared. But those who maybe score a 27, a 24 don't show that same deficit. They actually tend to show hyperreactivity in terms of startle. So there does seem to be some evidence that there's a cut score. That doesn't negate the fact, though, that there's also a continuum. And this is kind of why the term psychopath, sociopath, psychopathic traits gets really complicated, because there are some individuals that could show aspects of psychopathy. There are people who could be manipulative, who are glib, who are fearless and dominant over other people, but that's not necessarily the same as the whole sort of unitary construct of psychopathy. And so really there has to be a combination of those types of interpersonal affective deficits and impulsive antisocial behavior. And as soon as there's that sort of combination, you tend to get higher on those scores and likely go over that 30 mark, for example, on the PCLR.
All right. That just opened up a Pandora's box of questions, which I probably won't have time to get to, but we got to take a break right now. We'll come back for our final section after this.
You know it's wrong to kick a dog or throw a toy at Sue. To pull the legs off of a frog is not the thing to do. Your mommy and your daddy know that you are learning as you go. But one thing they may not tell you is about your friend at Bellevue. Even a sociopath has feelings. It may not show it's true. He's disconnected, disaffected, seems bad through and through. He may seem like your friend one day, the next some vile his spew. But even he has feelings. The sociopath just like you. If only there were some way to tell him. If only he could hear. But But sociopaths so seldomly tune in loud and clear. The more you try to help him, well, the more you'll live in fear. But even Mr. Sociopath can shed a bogus tear. Oh, a sociopath's life is an uphill climb. So much to detach from and so little time. If he wasn't removed so darn far, he surely would be ever so sorry. Though even though it seems difficult to detect, some patients might perhaps redeem his abominable defect. And if you see him coming to run, you may elect, for kicking, punching, and screaming threats have little or no effect. The only defense that you possess is to love him.
Yes, Doctor, thank you so much. I really appreciate you seeing me outside office hours. And yes, I will totally bring Chianti. That Dr. Lecter is so nice. Today's show was produced by Allison Ehrenreich, Betsy Kaplan, and me. Our interns are Allison and Josh Nalea. Greg Hill appeared in the intro and tweets for us at WNPR Colin. The part of Bill Curry was played by the talented Mr. Ripley. For show pages, articles, and copies of the Faith Middleton Show staff's favorite recipes for liver and fava beans, visit our website, WNPR.org. And now, back to Colin.
All right. This is the final segment of our conversation about sociopaths and psychopaths. And I have so many things that I want to ask both of our guests. So let's get right down to it. Actually, I'm going to start with you, Ariel Baskin-Somers, then we'll come back to Emmy Thomas. I do want to talk a little bit about what you're doing in the area of modification. I mean, everything that we've said so far might argue in the direction of, well, that's the way these people are. You'll never be able to trust them. They are broken units. But you're actually experimenting with and discovering things about ways in which their behavior or reactions can be modified?
Correct. I think there's a real utility to thinking about the deficits that psychopathic individuals have in terms of specific skill deficits. And in, like I mentioned before, that deficit in multitasking or attending to context. So myself and a number of colleagues have begun to address that type of skill deficit. So what we've been doing is actually taking psychopathic individuals and non-psychopathic individuals and having them play computer games. And this is a technique called cognitive remediation. It's been done in other disorders and deficits such as schizophrenia and ADHD. And basically what it entails is having people play games that target the specific neural pathways we believe are dysfunctional. So in these games, we might have individuals train themselves to pay attention to two pieces of information at once in order to perform well on the task. And they tend to complete these games 1 hour a week over a series of weeks. And what we've found is that individuals who got a treatment or training that matched their deficit. So a psychopath that got a training that was targeted for that attention to context deficit actually showed improvement over time in terms of their emotional responses on other laboratory tasks and on their decision making. But if a psychopath got a training that didn't have anything to do with attending to context, they did not improve. And so it's really the first step in terms of research of showing that you can not only target the type of deficits we see in psychopaths, but you could actually modify it. We believe that the brain is plastic, that it's constantly updating and changing, and this is one way to do that. There are other studies that are beginning to come out from labs such as Mark Dadd's work, where he's showing empathy training in kids with callous unemotional traits and showing some similar effects, that if you train these kids to learn to do empathetic processing, that they show improvement over time.
I mean, this would blow the minds of a lot of ancient philosophers and medieval philosophers and Renaissance philosophers because, okay, so there's sort of fake it until you make it. We're familiar with that idea. But neuroplasticity, as you say, suggests that if you begin to repeat certain cognitive functions again and again and again because of reasons that have nothing to do with altruism or empathy or anything like that, but because you'll get rewarded in a certain way if you pay attention to the crying child while you're in a big hurry to get to the buffet table, that if you do that over and over again and things like that, you actually are, in fact, building a capacity, building a real capacity, not a fake capacity, right?
Correct. There is an opportunity to train people to engage in a behavior that's more automatic, and in this particular case, that's more automatic and fits with sort of the social norms of how we tend to want to engage with the world around us.
So, Emmy Thomas, as you listen to that, it sounds a little bit like your prosthetic moral compass, although not exactly the same thing. I mean, even based on our conversation so far, and I hope I'm not hurting your feelings when I say this, I'd be a little nervous about going on a camping trip to Alaska with you. I just feel as though if things headed south, you wouldn't necessarily save me, and you might have some elaborate explanation why the cost benefit of just trekking out of the wilderness without me made a tremendous amount of sense. But on the other hand, I sense that you do want to improve, right? You do not want to be the basest kind of sociopath that you can be. You want to be a better sociopath.
Well, I think that's right. I think there are a lot of traits that really help me, sociopathic traits. But I think there are a lot that also hurt me, that prevent me from having long, meaningful relationships, that prevent me from having long, continued career success. If everything has an expiration date of like 2 to 3 years before I can't keep up the mask anymore, then that's not really a promising life. So I think that I have, over this past decade and a half or so, really tried to self-examine and at first I did come up with little fixes. It sounds like this, and like the prosthetic moral compass. Like, how can I figure out a way to sort of mimic what other people have done? Recently, I've actually been going to therapy, and for whatever reason, my therapist has really been helping. Sort of the advice that they give, the general advice, like, you shouldn't resent people. My therapist is like, no, every emotion that you think that you're kind of feeling, really stop and feel and try to identify it, because that is an emotion and that is what you're feeling. And if you cover it up, then that's just mask wearing. Another one is, being self-absorbed. How do I stop manipulating? I actually, until recently, didn't even know how to stop manipulating because there was nothing to replace it with. It was the idea of, I can take it down a mask, or I can stop trying to get you to do something. But then what do I do instead? There was nothing there underlying, no sense of self with which to act, I felt. And so his approach has been trying to get me to realize I do have a preference in a situation and to be entirely selfish, act as if the rest of the world doesn't exist and make the decision. And then that that's not a manipulative decision because you're not worried about the effect it's going to have on anyone else besides you.
You said at the beginning of your statement there are benefits to being a sociopath. I wish I had like another hour to ask you some more questions about this. I've got like 2 minutes. I immediately sort of think, well, what does she mean by that? And obviously, you can sort of get right to the point of certain things. And I started thinking about, what's often called the trolley experiment or the trolley thought experiment, where, and there are different versions of it, but basically it comes down to questions like, would you deliberately kill one person or, deliberately cause the death of one person, knowing that by doing that you might be saving 5 other people if the trolley went down the other track? And obviously a lot of people find it very difficult to intentionally kill a person even if they know that there's a greater benefit somewhere down the line. Do you think you'd be better at something like that, or would some of these concerns be difficult for you to process at all? Like, why do I even care which way this particular scenario plays out?
I think in my current situation would. I don't know if, the more advanced over the 30 benchmark psychopaths would, but I do think, you look at spies, you look at soldiers who are very successful, these generals who, that's basically what they're doing, is making that decision every day. Should we kill, a few of these people in order to save this other larger number? And I do think that would really come in handy. You at least would not feel any of the sort of psychological disturbance that somebody who is highly empathetic would probably feel. I
mean, we just got a tweet or a message saying, I hope you'll mention the benefits of psychopathy in corporate America. So some people who are pretty critical of corporate America will say, well, there's CEOs all the time who decide, all right, we could make sure that 10 fewer people died as a result of our product, but there would be a significant drop in earnings or profits or something like that. Do you feel like in some ways you're criticized for something that in other ways makes the world go round, as they say?
Yeah, exactly. I do think that it's often the case. We have a life is approximately $2 million. We learned that in the law. If somebody dies, then it's approximately valued at $2 million. Why? I think that shocks a lot of people, And so if you were to make a law that said negligence, should we fix the trains in order to save one person every 1,000 years, and fixing the trains is going to be $10 million, then no, we shouldn't fix the trains, because the value of a life is $2 million and it would cost $10 million.
All right. I wish I could ask another question, but if I do, I'll be really sorry because we've only got a minute left. Instead, I am going to profusely thank, first of all, you, Emmy Thomas, author of the book Confessions of a Sociopath, A Life Hiding in Plain Sight. You can also visit Emmy Thomas's popular blog, sociopathworld.com. Here in the studio, I also want to thank Ariel Baskin-Somers, an associate professor of psychology at Yale, who's working in all these really interesting ways about whether psychopaths can be trained to process emotions kind of the way that we do. I won't use better. I'll be neuro-accepting and say, the way we do anyway. That was our show about psychopaths and sociopaths. We recorded it last August. Thanks to Allison Ehrenreich for putting together such a great panel of guests. Thank you for listening.
I have no human empathy. I'm aloof, but charming, and I'm selfish and cunning.
So you're a sociopath?
No, I'm a cat.